Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report, covering the global insurrection against bankster occupation. For months, we've been telling you that the globe is on fire from people in the streets looking for some scalps. I noticed down there in Athens, they actually put up a few nooses. So good things yet to come. Stacey Herbert, tell us more.
Yes, Max, the raging Greeks have staged the biggest protest yet, and that's seen in this headline, Giabo. Thieves, hustlers, bankers. So Giabo, of course, is the global insurrection against banker occupation. And at the weekend's protest in Athens, the article says that amidst a sea of splayed hands waved at the Parliament building, apparently an offensive gesture for Greeks, one demonstrator raised a placard reading, "Bravo, Yemen," whose president underwent surgery in Saudi Arabia for injuries suffered in a rocket attack on his palace. And then another drew comparisons with rallies earlier this year in central Cairo, which ousted Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. From Tahrir Square to Sintama Square, we support you.
Well, this is what the banksters fear. And this is something that we knew would happen, that the various protests around the world are becoming co-joined, co-mingled, conjoined. So that you've got the folks in North Africa and the Middle East joining forces with the people in Europe, and they're communicating with each other. So the social networking revolution that we saw in Tunisia and Egypt, using social networking sites and the globalized technological infrastructure, is going global. And this poses a problem for those trying to manage this revolution from taking place.
Well, yes, and we've talked about the red state, blue state concept where they divide the population into two and then try to pit them against each other. And this is clearly not working, that we've had this anti-Islam campaign that hate the Arabs and the Muslim people, don't, unite with them. But we're seeing over and over again, including in the next headline, Senate page fired for anti-Harper protest. So this young woman, Brigitte Depop, held up, as you can see in this picture, Stop Harper sign, and she walked out onto the floor of Parliament in Canada and was promptly arrested. But she released a statement saying that this country needs a Canadian version of an Arab Spring, a flowering of popular movements that demonstrate that real power to change things lies not with Harper, but in the hands of the people when we act together in our streets, neighborhoods, and workplaces.
Okay, so now the global insurrection against bankster occupation has now skipped over into North America. So now it's in Canada. Now it's in Europe, in Athens, in Dublin, all over in pockets of resistance. It's in North Africa. It's in the Middle East. Now, as I've been predicting, it will be in the United States last, because the price of gas in the U.S. is still cheap, and that's been the main way for the powers that be to manipulate and to keep the locals and the natives quiescent, is to keep the price of gas as cheap as possible. But as the dollar collapses, as part of this global insurrection against bankster occupation, the price of gas and energy is going up. And in the U.S., my prediction is that once gas goes over $6 a gallon, we'll see the first full-scale riot in a major city against the banksters in America.
Let's talk about some other people failing to rise up. Britons bet on lottery to save the day. Camelot, the UK national lottery operator, has celebrated record sales at a time when the revenues of most lotteries globally are static or declining. Its success suggests people are increasingly clinging to the eternal hope of winning a fortune in austerity. So they talk about that sales had jumped to a level last seen in September 2008 when Lehman Brothers collapsed.
That's right. Volatility and chaos always favors those who are perpetuating the volatility and the chaos. As we know, there were many bets made on the 9/11 events weeks before the 9/11 events, taking advantage of the chaos. We know that people in Greece were making bets in the credit default swap market on the collapse of Greece, before the collapse of Greece, because they know that the chaos increases the value of the options. In fact, the options pricing volatility formula that is the bulwark that generates much of the trading activity and the $600 trillion in derivatives around the world is based on this concept of pricing volatility. And in my opinion, this goes back to the 1970s when listed options first began trading. This is the beginning of the end for neolibertarianism as we see the result of allowing bankers with unlimited funds taking zero risk, because remember they get bailed out every time they lose money, shaking the globe to death for a few nickels that fall out in the form of their $140 billion bonuses per annum down there on Wall Street.
But this sign is also that we are indeed living in a casino gulag state. When all else fails, they only have the lottery left.
Well, the lottery is always the last resort for those who are on their last dollar. And as the economy around the world collapses, those who find themselves down to their last dollar, I call it the Willy Wonka effect. They will take that last dollar and buy a lottery ticket.
Well, speaking of dollars, U.S. trade deficit widens in March on pricier oil. That doesn't sound very good, but in fact, U.S. companies in March sold the most goods and services overseas in nearly 2 decades. So the weaker dollar is being credited for that. But a big jump in oil prices pushed America's trade deficit higher. So the trade deficit actually rose 6% to $48.2 billion, according to the Commerce Department. What did the Republicans do? They attacked China. But 2/3 of the trade deficit comes from the price of oil.
Well, we've explained this on this show many times. The lower dollar will boost exports, but it will increase the cost of the importation of the raw commodities that go into your exports, like oil, much more than you're going to realize on the cost differential on your exports, hence the greater trade imbalance. The fact that nobody communicates this to the average American is shambolic.
So they did say that excluding oil imports, the deficit narrowed. The lower value of the dollar is helping exports, but they're in a spiral because as the global empire and the reserve currency, all of these commodities are priced in dollars.
It's the mathematics of insanity. Yeah, sure, we increased our exports, but we're losing money at the end of the day. It's like this new IPO going public, Groupon. They lose money on every sale, but they're going to make it up on volume, they promise, as they go public for a $20 billion or so valuation. And has been described, it's a guaranteed failure Ponzi scheme. Within 5 years, the company won't exist anymore. And yet, Ponzi schemes are valuable in America.
But, well, speaking of insane mathematics, a quote from the article reads, "Still, economists expect the fast rise in exports will boost growth in the April-June quarter, even with high oil prices. That's because the government adjusts for inflation when calculating the nation's gross domestic product." So America, the numbers will report that actually, despite our trade deficit, we're a booming economy because we don't count oil prices.
That's right. They will change the way they calculate growth.
Well, they already don't count rising oil prices or home prices in inflation numbers. So the inflation numbers you deduct from your GDP.
That's right. So if they need to, they will readjust it again to make it look like something that it's not, which is a viable, growing economy. This is something that the U.S. government does very well. They statistically lie.
And so, in a casino gulag state, the casino has that precise little algorithm that when they need to let somebody win at the slot machine, and so they continue in this cycle of spirals of debts and bad behavior. Well, here is Saudi Prince Al-Walid bin Talal being interviewed, and he's asked about the price of oil and is it too high?
The state position of Saudi Arabia, we want the price to be between 70 and 80, not only to help the West, but also to help ourselves. We don't want the West to go and find alternatives, because clearly the higher price oil goes, the more you have incentive to go and find alternatives. So really our interest coincides with the American interest, to have the price for around 70, 80, which is the price good for consumers and producers.
And a great example of the casino gulag mentality. They know that there's a sweet spot where Americans will continue to bankrupt themselves by buying oil that's killing their economy and their ecology simultaneously. And the casino gulag model is a good reference point. The casino economics. They get that perfect mix of winning percentages from the slot machines, alcohol, and oxygen. They adjust the level of oxygen and the alcohol in the drinks and the winning percentages at the slot machines to keep people in a maximum state of loss. of money loss. And those are just three of the factors that go into the algorithms that drive the casino. Now these people drive the U.S. economy. They know by keeping gas at a certain price, they can continue to put policies in place that are part of the prison industrial complex and the Pentagon and the militarization of the economy, and totally ignore the fact that at the end of the day, folks are going bankrupt and they're eating mud pies like the folks they screwed in Haiti.
That's right. And of course, speaking of Fox News, which is the one pushing the Republican agenda of it's China causing our trade deficit, not oil prices. Florida justice, rich man will do no time for killing 2 tourists in exchange for cash restitution to their families. So this goes with the Saudi prince, who owns 7% of Fox News. And we see that more and more Sharia law seems to be, we know it's being demonized, and in fact it's outlawed in Florida. I think they were passing laws about that. But it's reserved for rich people and for banksters. They get 0% interest rates. They don't have to pay any usurious fees or interest rates. And they get to escape justice by paying off somebody, whether it's Blackwater or this man, a millionaire playboy who killed 2 British tourists in Florida when his $150,000 Porsche jumped the curb, will not go to jail, despite the fact that he fled the scene and lied to police officers about who is behind the wheel during the accident. Instead, he will pay cash restitution to the victim's family, settling a civil suit on condition that he not go to prison.
Right, so the banksters are living a selective version of Sharia law in a state like Florida where the Republican sock puppets like this minister who burned the Koran in Florida to rally the stupid people to vote for more Republicans who deregulate the banking industry to allow the people in the banksters to live like a modified version of Sharia law.
That's right. And then finally, we have, speaking of one of the richest men in the world, we have a new top 100 rich list, Max. Bitcoin top 100 rich list from 3rd of June 2011. Here's a little video I made of the top 100. As you can see, it's they're all anonymous.
This is fantastic. This is the new Forbes fortune list, isn't it? These are the Bitcoin fortunes. And notice, yes, all numbers. It's pure anonymous. And this is the biggest story of this decade going forward, is the transition from the old way of doing business around the world to the Bitcoin way of doing business, which is purely anonymous. And this is the great achievement of the global insurrection against banker occupation. Bitcoin is the currency of the resistance. Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more coming away, so stay right there.
While kings go mad, their people suffer. How some take advantage of power that was given to them. Secrets of big, dirty money on RT.
More than a month in one of the most extreme environments on the planet.
This is Antarctica, and people have to be aware that they are far away from civilization.
Sean Thomas discovers what makes Antarctica so special and attractive for many.
The wildlife in Antarctica is both unique and fragile.
Expedition to the bottom of the Earth on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to Sweden and talk with Rick Falkvinge, founder of the Pirate Party. Rick, am I pronouncing that correctly, your name?
Fairly correct. It's Rick Falkvinge, actually. It's a Scandinavian name, but yeah, I'm here.
All right, Rick Falkvinge. You have recently written in Declaration of War. You call for the formation of an Internet Liberation Army. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I tend to agree with its sentiments. There's anonymous, there's lots of activism going on right now, and there's this philosophical question about who's really police and who's crook right now. What we're seeing is a struggle over the power over information. Who's guarding what people can access? Who is determining what knowledge can be accessed by whom? And I think this is going to be a pretty defining fight for the next decades to come.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the Swedish Pirate Party. So this is an actual political party with representation in the Swedish political body, as I understand it, correct? And how did you get that to that point? And just to clarify, the main platform or manifesto of the Swedish Pirate Party is addressing the imbalances and inequities in copyright and intellectual property laws, correct?
That's right. The Pirate Party was founded on January 1st, 2006, and in just 3.5 years, we managed to grow enough to get into the European Parliament, and we have 2 seats there today. We were the 3rd largest party by membership at our peak, and also in the polls, and that's quite a significant indicator of what the next decade is going to be about. It's going to be about privacy. It's going to be about the right to share. It's going to be the right to access information, culture, knowledge. And first and foremost, I think there is an ancient regime that's going to try to clamp down on this to preserve the status quo. And the youth is revolting against this. And they did that at the polling booths at election day. So there is a youth movement. This has been compared many times to the ascent of the Green movement when the Green parties arrived worldwide, and I see many, many parallels.
Right. There is a parallel, certainly, in terms of the environment, if you will, of intellectual property. And to take a step back and to put this in context on a broader perspective, the idea of the manifesto behind the Pirate Party is that all intellectual property originates from something called the public domain. All ideas, all reconfiguring of ideas, all works of creation, whether it's books, movies, television, art, etc., they all originate in some way from the commonly owned public domain. They then have a very limited period of monopoly value protected under copyright law, after which time all of these works of art and creativity should return to the public domain. So the question is, do you agree with that characterization, number one? And number two, is there any period of time that the Pirate Party would support that would be the period of a limited monopoly value for intellectual property, or is that completely out of the manifesto?
I think you're nailing it here. What we're seeing is that the copyright monopoly has come completely out of hand, and when it's being reviewed by independent experts, as in academia, as opposed to funded by the copyright lobby itself, we're seeing that optimum monopoly terms vary between 1 and perhaps 7 or 9 years, which is way shorter than today's lifetime plus 70 years. We need to ask ourselves, why does the copyright monopoly, and for that matter the patent monopoly, exist? And it's said to be as an incentive to create. But already, when you go there and say that it's an incentive to create more if you've done something successful, it doesn't justify why the current term is life plus another 7 years, because no author, to my knowledge, has kept writing books after they're dead and buried. So it's at least 7 years too long. And when you look at it, it's justifiably much too long. So we're sort of putting a stake in the ground and estimating that a shortening to 5 years from the date of publication might be a good start, just to see how that fares. On the other hand, you also have this issue with that the copyright monopoly has crept into our private communications. It was a distribution monopoly at the start. It was a commercial monopoly, and a commercial monopoly only. For some reason, the publishers have imagined that this monopoly also applies to us, honest Joe, and that the monopoly should dress itself in police uniforms and perform dawn raids on honest citizens. And that's not what it's there for. You can't criminalize something that 250 million Europeans are doing on a weekly basis. It doesn't work that way. You see the lawyers at the old publishing houses saying that because since the law is not walking in lockstep with technology, obviously the technology is broken and needs to be fixed with the assistance of the law. Whereas pretty much the rest of the population is saying, well, since the law and the technology doesn't walk in lockstep anymore, obviously the law is broken and need to be fixed with the help of technology.
All right, I want to talk about that disconnect between the technology and the law in a second. But I want to go back to a phrase you used there, the optional monopoly value, as being your estimates, or by some estimates, between, let's call it, between 7 and 9 years. So in other words, if you take an artist like an Elvis Presley, who borrowed heavily, if not cloned, many of the blues artists in America back in the 1950s and repackaged material that was already, that came before him, and launched a successful career as rock and roll, which was just putting a new beat to the existing blues material that was already extant throughout the South in America. So for a period of time, the Elvis Presley artist capitalized fantastically on this repackaging of ideas that he pulled from the public domain that were not his ideas. And then at some point, it makes sense to allow the copyright to expire, to allow those ideas to return to the public domain so that somebody else can use them. And what you're saying is that because they're on the books for a lifetime plus 70 years, it is in fact stifling creativity, which at the end of the day is actually stifling the economy.
The copyright lobby is arguing that longer copyright is good for creativity. What we are seeing is the exact opposite. Real artists do not wait for permission to create. And just as you're saying, imagine how many Elvis Presleys we haven't had because of this monopoly.
Right, and you know, there is an instinct to copy. Certainly within every human cell is contained DNA that spends its entire life on this planet seeking to reproduce itself through sexual reproduction in the case of human beings. There is at the cellular level, an instinct to copy and reproduce. So again, by thwarting the very instinct of humanity, you are effectively giving humanity a collective lobotomy.
Let me tell you just how hardwired we are to copy. There's this tradition of when you're drinking coffee or tea, you're sort of extending your little finger a little bit. I'm sure you all have seen when we grab cups, we do it a little bit like this. And there was a researcher trying to find, where does that come from? And this was tracked way back into England in the 1600s. And at that point, it turns out that people have just kept doing it ever since for pretty much no reason, just because everybody else was doing it. And it turns out that where this comes from is that in royal and nobility circles at that time, you had a lot of unprotected sex. And one of the first symptoms of syphilis is that your fingers start to stiffen. That's just how hardwired we are to copy.
Right. So this, what we call in the technology space a meme, which would be the intellectual equivalent of a gene, has the same prerequisite and mandate to copy itself. So we got a couple of minutes left here. I want to talk now of the relationship with the technology and the law. So the big debate is which is more important, or which came first. Is it the technology or the law? Well, clearly, those who argued for copyright, going all the way back to, let's say, the Constitution of the United States, I believe it's Article 17, where Thomas Jefferson was debating at that time that there should be no intellectual property rights at all, because it's a net negative to the economy.
Exactly.
But
you could copy freely and add value without diminishing your own. He was arguing quite well about that.
Right. So so now, because of the copyright extension laws, we have what Lawrence Lessig calls perpetual copyright, and you have the state of copyright law being clearly, without a shadow of a doubt, anyone who's looked into the legal statutes and the history of this, there's no way that they could possibly come out of this thinking that the law is being respected in the spirit of how the law was generated originally. So folks like MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, the Recording Industry Association of America, they are basically changing the law to suit their very narrow interests, but at the expense of what is obviously implied and inferred and talked about in the Constitution.
One needs to remember here is that it's the job of every industry lobby to try to change the law to better suit their industry. They're trying to tweak society to get on top of everybody else, essentially. And that's the lobby's job. The people I blame for this are the politicians whose job it is to see things for what they are and look at it in a bigger perspective and see, okay, these guys are asking for that. What's the cost to society? And politicians have failed miserably at doing that particular job. And it did arrive, actually, it arrived in 1557 with Queen Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, who was trying to clamp down on the printing press as it allowed knowledge to roam free without control of the crown and the church at the time. You won't see this in the copyright history as described by the copyright lobby, but it was originally an instrument to crack down on expression and speech, on free speech.
Rick, we're out of time, actually. I wanted to talk about Bitcoins because you announced that you have put all of your savings into Bitcoins. I'm going to have to bring you on again to talk to you about that. But before we go, I did want to ask you one thing. NATO has declared war on Anonymous, the group that's out there fighting the good fight for intellectual property. Are we going to see armed combat between hackers, file sharers, etc., versus the Hollywood copyright cartels? It's already a bit of a war. Is it going to escalate?
I think the conflict is definitely escalating. What I think is interesting is that the United States and Israel have already hacked uranium centrifuges in Iran. And what NATO is essentially saying is that Iran would be justified in having an armed conflict back. So if they want to open that door, I think they're going to find it swings both ways.
Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report, and we'll have you back on again soon.
Thank you for having me on the show. Cheers.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. And I want to thank my guest, Rick Falkvinge. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.